Hello, this is Gary Marr of Glenelg Community College. This screen capture is for my CIS 166AA students. In the screen capture, I wanted to go through some code examples for topics covered in chapters 2, 3, 4, and then I'll also use the debugger, which is in chapter 5. These three files on top here, I'm in brackets right now. The HTML, the JavaScript, and the CSS files are ones that I created. I don't think I covered this on Monday. I think I created it after the fact. But this is a simple example of many of the topics which are covered in those first initial chapters. So let's start with the HTML file. It's HTML5. It's going to be English. I have in the header a reference to CSS, an external CSS file, which is here. And like JavaScript, CSS can be embedded or it can be external. It's better to keep it external because it too has syntax different than HTML and different than JSS, and when you start mixing and matching, it can create a whole lot of alphabet soup on your HTML file. So I've got it in a separate file. The other thing I've done is I put at least part of my code in a separate JavaScript file, which is the JS file. Again, to make it separate and easier to read, hopefully in the long run, because it isn't mingled in there with the HTML. And I believe finally, there's a finally in the head section. There's also a section of JavaScript that's inside the script tags. This is embedded. This is external. Okay, and this works the same way with CSS. I could have internal or external CSS. I could have inline or internal or embedded JavaScript or external JavaScript. When I run this, and the best way to do this inside of brackets is to go to Live Preview. This should open up my Chrome browser, which it does, and start execution. So I've got an alert message there. I've got another one that's going to ask for a name, and then it's going to bring me up to this screen, which is going to prompt me for some information. So I'm going to put $100 in there. I'm going to put a tax rate of 7%. I'm going to hit a grand total, and it's $107, all looking good. Now what this is actually doing behind the scenes is it's doing some event processing on the button. It's actually saving output from the calculation into a text box, and it's also reading information from a text box as part of the calculation. So it's doing a lot of stuff here. It's using an alert prompt in the beginning to give me the day's date, and then it uses also a prompt built-in function to gather some information about my name, although I'm not reporting it back to this screen. This is very similar to what you're going to have to do in assignment 2, but probably a lot more advanced than you have to do in assignment 2. So let's look at the code. If I go, and let's just shrink this down, let me go back into the HTML first. Important parts here. When you're working with embedded script, what's inside the script tags is just JavaScript. So I identify a variable called today. I'm going to use a built-in object called date. JavaScript also has built-in objects called windows and escapes me. Why can't it escape me? And document. And we'll be using those also. And what an object is basically data and a whole bunch of functions or snippets of code called methods. So what happens here is I get an instance of date, and I'm going to call it today. So my program is called today. And then what I'm going to do is from that instance of the object, I'm going to call its getDate method, which is built into the object. I got that when I created the instance. And I'm going to store what it returns inside the date variable. In fact, to be completely good, I should prefix that with variable. And then I'm also going to store the month inside the month variable. Now notice here I'm adding 1 to the month to the end of it. So it's going to give me some number that represents a month. I'm going to add 1 to it. The way that the date function, the date object works with month is it actually stores it as an array. And we haven't learned arrays yet. It's actually the end of chapter 4, I think. We're not going to cover it until later, 3 or 4. But what it does, it's using the subscript. And the subscript started at 0. So if I simply show the month without adding 1 to it, it'll be 1 month off. That's just a little quirky thing about the date object. There's my alert. Alert's a built-in function. This is something that gives me a dialog box with some information inside it. This is given to me from JavaScript. It's a routine somebody included with the JavaScript code, and it's so generic and so useful they included it with the product. Typically things like date, alert, prompt, those kinds of built-in helper functions are in all languages, but obviously have real benefit to us because that little alert message there allows us to put error messages, warnings, etc. out there without doing a lot of coding. All the alert wants to see inside it is some string that's going to display. And what I've done is taken the month day, added a slash, added the day, added a slash, and then I hard-coded the year. I could also get the year from this also. I didn't do that, but I could have. And then I'm going to write two blank lines using the write line method of the object called document. And then write line and write are discussed in one of the chapters. I can't remember which one it was. It's 4 or 5. And they're somewhat useful, but they're not as useful as simply creating pages which have all of the inputs defined as input boxes and all the outputs defined as input boxes that are read-only, or using alert and prompt. That's a little cleaner. It's more of a GUI solution. Document write does have its values, but it's not as, I think, as flexible as some other techniques we're going to learn in class. Here's the prompt built-in function. That's another popular one. What this is going to do, throw up a name. It could have a default if I wanted it, but I didn't set a default value. And whatever I key in there is going to put in the name. I'm not using name for anything here. I don't display name. I'm just going to use the prompt function so I could mostly just talk about it. Once the header section's front, it enters the body. In here I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 input tags. One's called amount, one's called tax rate, one's called total, one's called calc. I set the, let's see, the values aren't set for the text boxes. This is actually a button. The last one's a button. I set the value for that to be grand total so that when you see the screen, you're going to see a, first of all, a label called amount, and then next to that, you're going to have a box for the amount, then tax rate, the amount, total amount down the left side of the page, and then at the very bottom of it, there'll be a button that'll say calculate. So the way this program, when it runs, is going to work is it's going to go get me the date. It's going to display the date as a pop-up alert. Then it's going to ask me for my name, and then it's going to display the HTML page. All right, great. So it displays the HTML page. That covers HTML and CSS. What's JavaScript too? Well, the JavaScript file has a special object method called OnLoad. And when this is invoked, what it does is it looks for some code to load at the start of the page. And now we're going to find there's some slight differences between this and jQuery. jQuery is basically just JavaScript that's been, well, on steroids. It does a lot more. It lets us write code that's much shorter. And also the JavaScript is cross-browser compatible. So one of the big advantages of jQuery is if we use that in places, we don't have to worry about things looking different, whether we run it on Chrome versus Edge versus Internet Explorer versus Firefox. And we'll get into more of that as we get deeper into class. So I have one function here called calc. I have a one statement down here that's going to kick off when I start my page. This is a function expression, which means it's not a named function. It's an anonymous function, has no parameters. And what it's going to do is initially I put an alert here to make sure I got there, made sure that it loaded. But now that I know that it loaded and I've tested it, I've taken it out. That's part of the test piece in Chapter 5. I left it there in case I want to put it back in someday, though. The next two statements, okay, this one on click has to do with the event that I'm creating for the calc ID. So get element ID says, okay, go to your HTML and find an ID called calc. Okay, there it is. What is it? It's a button. Okay. On that, if it's clicked, then I want you to run the calc function. There it is. Calc function is a named function. All right, we'll talk about that in just 1 second. The other thing it does on the OnLoad is it sets the focus of the cursor into the ID called amount. Well, what's that? If I go back up here, the ID amount is associated with the very first prompt up there for the amount I'm entering. Okay? Do I have to put amount in there, or do I have to put the focus in there? No, I can leave it out. But it is a method that exists with the document object. These are chained. I can tell they're chained. That's one of the discussions I'll talk about in Chapter 4 because of this dot. I could do this in 2 statements, or I could do it in 1. If I chain it, okay, what I'm saying is, okay, get this object and then run the onClick method. And if I, on this one, it says simply go to that object and use the focus method to put the cursor wherever I've identified, in this case on the amount text box. So if I click the button, it goes to calc. It says get the amount out of the amount box. Get the amount out of the tax rate box. Now this is a little easier and cleaner than using prompts. Prompts are messy. This simply says take what's in the text box, the user keyed on the HTML page, and it's chained, so it looks at the value property of that object, and says store that in amount. Take the tax rate property, store that in rate. So I now have two variables to work with. The next thing I do is I check to make sure that both of these entries are numeric. Okay. And if they are not numeric, I print the error message. And I don't do a lot of testing with this one. The email program in Chapter 1 is a lot more robust when it comes to checking input variables or checking input data from your screen. But it does have an else. So if it's true, which means it's not a number, it's going to give me an error message. If they are numbers, it's going to do a simple calculation. It's going to create a new variable called total. It's going to hold another calculation. And then finally what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the ID called total, and I'm going to change its value to be whatever this total variable answer was with a fixed decimal format. So again, back to the actual code. All right, I'm using 1 digit there. Let's use 2 just to be creative. 1 second. Where'd I go? There it is. Let's make this a 2. I'm pretty sure I don't use that a lot, but I'm pretty sure it makes it a 2-digit number. Okay, let's go back up here. Let's do a refresh. Okay, there's that first message, which is the date, and that date looks correct, so I must be using that correctly. So now I'm going to ask me for my name. G is good enough. Now it's going to stop at this screen. It's looking for input, so I'm going to put 100. I'm going to put a tax rate of 7. I'm going to click on total. Oh, it's not giving my 2-digit number. I guess I'm not using that correctly. I'll have to look at that that format. Whatever it's not format, it's called. What do they call it here? I don't do a lot of formatting with it. Too fixed. All right, so back to this. And if I hit my rebrowse or my reload, it's going to run through the process again. I'm going to empty the screens. Notice how the focus is on the first field. 5, tax rate of 1. There's my total for that. All right, so let's do this. Let's now run the debugger with this. I'm going to hit the 3 dots. I'm going to come down here and hit More Tools, Developer Tools. Okay, that's one way of getting it. Now, sometimes the display is over here. I think it remembers where you used it last. And you can control that with, let's see, I think it's up here. Yeah, so if you hit those 3 dots, you can have it below on the left side, the right side, or you can have it, I guess, tiled. I typically keep it at the bottom because some of these statements get kind of long. So, again, the way you're going to get to that is the 3 dots, Tools, Developer Tools. Okay, or if you right-click on the screen and take Inspect, it gives you the same information. So the Elements tab, which ends up being the starting point here, will be useful when we start looking at the DOM and the relation between parent and child. It's a little early to do that, but we'll talk about that, I think, starting in Chapter 8, I believe it is, or 6 or 8. I can't remember which one it starts with. Console is important. Console is going to tell us if there's a syntax error, if there's any error behind the scenes that is causing a problem with this code. Sometimes, in fact, most of the time, errors do not appear on your browser screen with JavaScript. They just don't show up. So this will tell us an error, and I'll make an error. We'll see in a second here. And then finally, source. This is going to allow us to run the debugger on the JavaScript code. So let's do this first. Let's come back over to our brackets, and let's cause, let's see, what can I do to make an error here? I'll tell you what, let's go back over the HTML. Might be easier there. And I'm going to change the name of this to be A. So that CSS file no longer exists. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to my live browser. I'm going to, let's let this finish. Let me rebrowse the screen. And did I pick one that's going to catch? Let's see, I may not have. Well, no, that happens to be one. I don't think it's going to, oh, there it is. Okay. So what it's saying is this file, again, it ran. Okay. It ran. Not the right colors, but it ran. But if I look at the console, there's an error there. And it says on line 8, Okay, the file could not be found. Well, it does. There's no A, and that's my hint as to what to fix. If I come back over here, change it back to where it was, hopefully that would fix it. Okay, and it should fix it. Now, that's one function of the developer's tools, okay, is to find those kinds of errors, which a lot of times are reference errors, sometimes syntax errors. The more important one, though, is to find logic errors. Now, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to Sources. I'm going to go to JavaScript, and it's going to show me all my JavaScript code. Now, I can't change it from this window. This is read-only. But what I am going to do is I'm going to put a breakpoint by clicking on the margin. So there's an arrow there, which means that's where I want my debugger to stop and let me walk through the code. Okay. So now once I've done that, I'm going to reload the page. It's going to show me the date. It's going to ask me for the name. Okay. And I'm going to have to key in an amount, a tax rate, because none of this is tripped yet because I haven't got part of the code that I set the breakpoint on. I'm going to hit the grand total, and now it's stopped. Okay, pause the debugger. And if I hold the cursor over the top of, or I can even just look above too, it's going to show me that the amount is 5, the rate is 1. And if I hold it over the top of the value, it'll always also show me what the value is. So if there was something not coming out right here, I can look and see what the current value rate is. It starts off as 1. Okay, it's going to stay as 1. Okay, and then if I step into this line of code, it takes me to the next statement. Okay, so rate is now 0.01 because it was divided by 1. I can check that over here too, and it shows me that there. And I can see, okay, amount is 5, rate is 0.01, and so when this execute, I can either know what my answer will be, or I can look at this here. Then my answer right now is 5.05. So what it's doing here is it's showing me the value of variables, and I can see these over here, the local variables, and also any global ones. I don't think there is any global ones at this point. Now there's system variables is all. And also it's showing me how my code is being executed in the order it's being executed. So that can be very helpful, especially if you have branching done with an if statement, or if you're doing loops and isn't working the way you want it to. If you found what you want to find, just want to continue the program from there, you can hit this button. Okay, this is the resume button. This is the button you use probably most of all when walking through it. Stepping out and step over has to do with functions, which I really don't have much of here. So I'm going to just take it and run it to the end. I can now close this window, rebrowse or reload everything, and then run it again. I'm taking for granted this is calculating correctly. That's less important right now for me than just showing you how the code works. All right, let's go back to the brackets. And back here, there's my 3 files. I will put these 3 files in the sample code for assignment 2. And you can look at it there, and you can also watch this video and get a pretty good idea of what's happening with this anyways. All right, let me stop there with this particular example, and I will do one more after this. Any questions, let me know, and this video should be up inside Module 3.